I'm Alex. Thank you all for coming out tonight and supporting your local independent bookstore as well as this wonderful author. This evening we have the pleasure of hearing from Erika Howsare about her book, The Age of Deer. Erika Howsare holds an MFA in Literary Arts from Brown University and has published 2 books of poetry. She also worked in local journalism for 20 years, covering culture and environmental issues. A native of Pennsylvania, she lives in rural Virginia. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the event. You can grab a copy of The Age of Deer up front after, if you've not already gotten one.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. Can everybody hear me okay with this? Okay. I've just been chatting away and have not gotten my book and my stuff out yet, so just bear with me here. Thank you, Alex, so much for the intro, and to Flyleaf for hosting me. This is my second time reading at Flyleaf, actually, so it's nice to be back. All right, so this book is, I usually describe it as a kind of long look at the relationship between humans and deer, starting in the deep past and then focusing quite a bit on the present time also. So it does cover a lot of sort of time and space. I'm going to be reading part of a chapter and showing some images, and we will have some time for Q&A after that. And I also like to just invite people to tell their deer stories during that Q&A portion. I find that just about everybody has some, and it's just interesting to hear what those experiences and encounters have been. So you could sort of think about that, you know, as I'm reading, if you have any you'd like to share. And also, I am going to, and since this is a small crowd, everybody will have plenty of time with this, but I just want to send around this little box which has some deer hair in it. This is from a deer that some of my family members hunted in Pennsylvania, and I have these in my possession because after they took the meat of the deer, I brought home the hide, and I've been trying to learn how to tan deer hides. So I want to just pass this around and kind of invite everybody, if you would like to just take a few of these, and you can put them in your pocket, take them home, sprinkle them in your garden, or, you know, put them on your windowsill, or whatever you'd like to do with them. But I just kind of wanted to invite a physical connection between everyone who's in this room and everyone who's in that part of the book where I described that hunting trip, and with the animal himself, who lived in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. So I'll start this going here. All right, so here it is. Okay. The book has a lot of different pieces and parts to it. I'm going to just give you kind of a quick preview of the first chapter before I get going into chapter 2. The first chapter deals with kind of mythology and art from around the world and through time, in which deer are important figures. So, for example, this is some European cave art. This is an image from Lascaux, and deer are one of the 4 most frequently depicted animals in the big cave galleries of Europe. So obviously they were important to people at that time and in that place. This is approximately a 2,000-year-old piece of metalwork, discovered in Denmark, but probably made somewhere closer to Greece. And it shows possibly a deity, or maybe just a human with antlers, and obviously a deer next to him. And this is a photo that I took in Abbots Bromley, England, where I went to observe this very ancient folk dance in which the dancers wear reindeer antlers on their heads. And this has been a yearly tradition there for close to 800 years. Okay, and then we're going to pick up the story somewhat more locally than that. This will be closer to where I live in Virginia. So this is chapter 2, Goods. I was a little late to meet the woman with the hide, so I jogged past the turnoff for the West African village and the English farm. I bypassed the German farm and followed the signs for the New World toward the Cracker Barrel sign that stabbed up from the horizon. It was October and the sky was a blameless blue. The interstate was a few hundred feet away through the trees and I could hear it roaring. Around the corner I spotted the Native American village and Mary Kate Claytor, cross-legged under a catalpa tree with a soggy deer hide spread out on the ground in front of her, flesh side up. This was the Frontier Culture Museum in Stanton, Virginia, an outdoor complex that sprawls over 200 acres of former farmland in the Shenandoah Valley. The museum attempts to tell the story of how a panoply of cultures from Europe, Africa, and North America amalgamated over hundreds of years to create a new American way of life. It's interactive. You can try on wooden clogs in the German farmhouse and chat with a blacksmith at work in the Irish forge. You can brush past banana trees growing in West Africa and pull a crosscut saw outside a 1740s log cabin, like the dwellings white settlers cobbled together on the forested frontier. As I approached Claytor, she was pressing the deer hide down over the sharp point of an awl made from a deer bone, trying to poke a hole. The hide had been waiting in a freezer since it was peeled off a whitetail by a hunter last fall. Early that morning, she'd taken it out and soaked it in water to help it thaw. Claytor was tall and rosy-cheeked, with black overalls, tattooed arms, and hair hidden by a dark knit cap. As she worked, her outgoing and ponytailed colleague, Misty Fur, explained to some visitors that this village represents indigenous cultures across a huge swath of territory, from Canada to Florida, from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean, the Eastern Woodlands nations, an impossibly large and varied world to be contained in just a handful of wigwams. We're in this weird place, non-native people interpreting native culture, Claytor would later tell me. But the hide tanning technique she demonstrated was at least one common thread shared by many groups in pre-contact North America. The awl balanced on its handle, pointing straight up, and Claytor wiggled the hide down over it. Finally, the point punched through. She'd already made most of the holes she'd need, at 5-inch intervals all around the edge of the skin. In front of her on the ground was a wooden frame with dozens of handmade nails pounded into it, and her next step would be to lace jute through the holes and around the nails so as to stretch the hide evenly over the frame. I was mesmerized by the hide itself. It lay fur side down in its mostly smooth surface, marbled with pinks, whites, and light browns in irregular patterns, like an aerial view of the desert floor. This side of the skin had been next to the body of the deer, the live side, you might say. Most of the flesh had already been removed. I asked if I could touch it. It was rubbery and slightly slimy, like raw chicken. And here's a few images from not this exact scene I'm describing, but from a hide that I was working on at my house. Whoops, I meant to tell you before. This is another image from sort of the deer in art and mythology of the past. This is part of this ended up as our cover image for the book. So this is a folk art image from rural Pennsylvania, which is also where I'm from. Okay, here's hide tanning. Just wanted to show you kind of the sheer beauty of this process. you know, the skin itself is just so luscious, and this is the stage where you're scraping the hair away. That's the membrane, this goopy part, Claytor said. She'd need to scrape that away, and on the hide's other side, all the fur and the grain, the top layer of skin, had to come off too. If you don't, it's harder for the oils from the tanning solution to penetrate, she said. You'll end up with crusty spots. As she began stretching, she tossed me a piece of finished buckskin so I could see the end result. As soon as I touched it, I wanted to take off my jeans and acrylic sweater and wrap my naked skin in this instead. It was seductive and velvety under my fingers, and much finer and more pliable than I'd imagined. It felt like the best possible way to clothe the human body. Its color was a subtle yellowy brown, and its irregular edges were slightly crispy, with small holes here and there. It had been preserved from decay, but it retained the feel of something organic and alive. Now Claytor wound and knotted jute around the nails and worked it through the holes in the hide. She'd begun with the neck of the deer, where the hide was thicker. Maybe, she explained, because it's the part of the body predators tend to latch onto with teeth or claws. She pointed out the place on the flank where a projectile had torn through. It's hard to tell if it was a gun or a bow, she said, poking her fingers into the hole. Arrow holes are usually triangular, but this one had a weird shape. It was actually two holes, eerily like the split heart print a deer hoof makes in snow. Stretching the hide was an unhurried process. Every time Claytor threaded another hole, she had to carefully pull the jute tight with one hand while massaging the hide outward with the other. Her fingers moved and shifted under the skin, persuading it to lengthen toward the frame. Sometimes the jute snapped, far more likely to break than the hide itself. Then she grabbed the hide at both shoulders and stretched it crosswise, her hands straining in opposite directions. I thought of clay, or maybe pizza dough, but a small spot of blood on one edge of the skin reminded me that this was part of an animal. The strength of deer skin is part of what made it so useful to indigenous peoples. As Claytor worked her way around the skin, Fur explained to two nearby couples that hides also became an important export from the American colonies back to Europe, where buckskin was used to make gloves and rawhide served as pulley cables. These skins help fuel the Industrial Revolution, and they make a lot of money for the mother country, she said. It's one of the colony's most stable exports, more reliable year to year than cash crops like tobacco. That trade changed life for Native Americans. They acquired European goods, and they hunted more deer to satisfy European demand. Fur wove a tale of interlocking changes that stretched from the woods of eastern North America to the shores of West Africa and down to the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. The usefulness of deer hides, their size, their pliability, their toughness and abundance, made them a valuable resource in the early global economy. But before that, they were a basic life material for people all over this continent. Claytor kept lacing down one flank of the hide. She was still less than halfway done stretching, and making finished buckskin would take days. She'd dry it and scrape it on the frame. Then she'd soak it in a tanning mixture, wring it out, soak, wring, maybe half a dozen times altogether. After that, she'd dry it again while stretching and handling it repeatedly to keep it soft and pliable. In the end, she'd smoke it over a smoldering fire to waterproof and preserve it. It's the tanning mixture that holds special importance in the history of deer in North America. Europeans, too, had long hide tanning traditions, but their standard recipes for tanning solutions involved urine or rotting bark, making a stiff, shiny leather. In North America, said Claytor, brain tanning was used more than any other method. Brains are full of fats and oils that lubricate the tiny fibers in the skin. Egg yolks can also work, or even Dawn dish soap. But in most mammals, the brain contains the right amount of material to tan the animal's own hide, an elegant and practical correspondence. Native Americans long used buckskin to make wrap skirts for women, breechcloths for men, dolls for children, and bags and moccasins for everybody. Buckskin was a basic material, like cotton is today, though people's sense of how it arrived at hand was surely more nuanced. Okay. Deer skins could be used in other ways too. With some hides, people tanned only the flesh side, left the fur on, and used them as blankets. They sewed whole skins into flasks for storing oil and honey. And they took rawhide, skin that is dried but not softened, and cut it spirally into one enormous length of tough, narrow cord with as many uses as duct tape has now. And here's a few images. These are not from this museum I'm writing about here, but from the Jamestown settlement in Jamestown, Virginia, where there's a kind of recreated Powhatan village. So here's a blanket on a bed inside a home. This kind of illustrates that lacing and stretching process that she's doing. Some buckskin moccasins there, and a bag with the lovely deer on it. And we'll get to this one in a sec. Some hides ended up playing fairly exalted roles. Fur showed me a picture on her phone. Powhatan's mantle, a 400-year-old hanging made of several buckskin hides sewn together and embellished with thousands of white marine snail shells. The shells form three figures, a human and two animals, one of which has cloven hooves like a deer, and a series of circles that probably represent settlements. The mantle may have belonged to the 17th century Powhatan leader Wahunseneka, the father of Pocahontas, in what is now Virginia. But like millions of other colonial-era buckskins, it too crossed the ocean to Britain. By 1638, it had arrived in London, and if you wanted to see it in person today, you'd have to visit the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. Okay. The jute broke again. Claytor, nearly finished lacing, patiently cut another length of twine and spliced it together, walking her fingers along the edge of the hide to find the next hole. We'd been sitting on the grass in the October sun for almost 2 hours as she pulled and stretched and knotted. A green catalpa worm dropped from the branches above and made its way across the tightening hide, where a few bits of grass clung to the membrane. Tug and knot, tug and knot. I asked whether in indigenous American communities hide tanning had been women's work. Claytor said yes, and explained that although every group had its own mores and traditions, in many communities women served as the domestic constants. To provide food, clothing, and shelter was a crucial and honored role. Processing a deer into its many parts and materials complemented the labor of hunting, and women's work was their own sovereign domain. So much was lost in a fog of erasure, as European colonists worked deliberately to separate indigenous people from their lifeways. The songs or stories, say, that might have accompanied this communal labor as women passed hours under trees. Claytor and Fur saw their work as a kind of ongoing engagement with half-obscured knowledge. They'd try things, examine archaeological evidence and oral histories, experiment and learn, and then try something else. Their ways were a mix of old and new, undertaken in 21st century clothing, with no pretense of reenactment, and sometimes with frank anachronisms. I was enchanted, for example, by the hide scraper Claytor made from a deer leg bone, but she readily offered, I had to make it quickly, so I used a Dremel tool. Non-native interpreters like her and Fur get information when they can from contemporary tribal members, but they also try to avoid undue prying, and especially failing to properly attribute knowledge to its sources. Even more important, the old ways changed over time and geography. They weren't the same everywhere, and as in all cultures, they evolved. If brain tanning a deer hide in the 2020s is a niche skill, It's still part of a long, ragged line of human knowledge transmission, and the deer and the hands are still real. At the time the deerskin trade between Native Americans and Europeans began, each side brought to the table its own long history with deer. For the Europeans, that was a story in which deer had gradually become like diamonds, luxury goods out of reach for most people. Go forward before I lose this again. There we go. Herds of fallow deer may have been kept in enclosed spaces in Britain during the Roman occupation, but it wasn't until after the Norman conquest in the 11th century that the practice of keeping a deer park, a large acreage attached to a castle and reserved for the production of venison, sometimes harvested by the resident lord in elaborate ritualistic hunts, really took off. Deer parks soon became a widespread phenomenon. By their heyday in the 14th century, parks in Britain may have numbered as many as 3,000. There were a number of parks in France as well. For a nobleman to enclose land as a deer park was first of all a way of showing off his money. The construction of a fence or wall to keep deer contained was, says one source, an elaborate and expensive undertaking. Such barriers had a special name, pales, from which we take our expression for someone out of bounds. They are beyond the pale. And if they try and fail to leap the fence, they may become impaled. Building the park was only the beginning of the expense. One needed a gamekeeper to manage the herd, a legion of groundskeepers to mow and tend. The average park was about 100 acres in size, but some were much more sweeping. A deer park in Lincolnshire, for example, grew to encompass 4,600 acres. The pales were constantly in need of repair, and poachers had to be dealt with. In the winter, deer sometimes required feed. At least one deer park included a shelter for the animals. All this flagrant spending occurred against a general background of scarcity. Still, the aristocracy saw deer parks as essential stages on which to demonstrate skill in the art of hunting. More materially, to fence deer in was to fence people out. In creating a deer park, a noble showed not only that he had been granted special hunting rights by the king, but also that he in turn was denying those rights to nearby commoners. There would be a steady supply of venison on his table, while his tenants could be punished by blinding, castration, or death for taking a deer from inside the pale. Feudal obligations might even force tenants to help maintain the very fence that kept them out. The social underpinnings of the deer park carry through to modern society on both sides of the pond. When the rich and powerful mix business and pleasure while hunting on a Texas ranch, where bucks of impressive size roam inside tall fences, they are recreating in a modern way the ritual of a medieval deer park. But even golf courses, highly manicured landscapes that cater to an elite aesthetic of nature, might descend from that long ago age when a special slice of the countryside became a set piece where powerful people showed off and reinforced their status. When Europeans landed in North America, these were their associations with deer. They encountered all kinds of novel animals, but in their minds, deer had a significance all their own. And here's one more deer park image that shows some of the hunting methods were not incredibly sporting, I would say. Finally, Claytor had the hide fully stretched. With its lacings and vaguely round shape, it looked like something from a Warner Brothers cartoon about a grizzled backwoods trapper. Claytor stood the frame on end and turned it around so I could see the fur side. And here's that. It was dark brown along the spine, lighter on the flanks, fading to white at the edges. The sun was behind it, and just for a moment it shone through the skin, making it glow pink and alive. Claytor leaned the frame against the catalpa tree and sized up her array of scraping tools. Besides the bone scraper she had made, she had a couple of palm-sized seashells and some steel tools representing the access to metal that Native Americans gained through trade with Europeans. She tried a bone tool first. It was made from a deer's cannon bone. On a person, it would come from the hand, so if you were looking at the deer, you would probably think this was like this bone here, but it's actually this one. It's much longer in a deer than it is in us, with little teeth carved into one end. When she pulled it along the flesh side of the skin, the membrane began to peel away. "It's doing it," she said, excited. A young guy in Carhartts and a sleeveless shirt wandered over to watch. He asked a few questions about making deer hide blankets, and then wondered, what else can you do with deer parts? Claytor showed him her bone scraper. You can also use hooves and scraps from the hide scraping to make glue. You can use the backstrap tendon, which runs along the spine, for bowstring and cordage and fasteners. These examples just barely began to answer the question. Almost every part of a deer has utility, and when native hunters returned home with a deer carcass, they carried far more than meat. If the work of hunting was married to the reciprocal work of processing, the body of a deer could offer everything from food and clothing to music, insulation, and paint. Fur gave me a tour of the wigwam village to show me other deer parts in use. A rake made from a 4-point antler lashed to a pole, a shovel made from a scapula. She showed me how the corner of a deer's jawbone can make a blunt tool that flakes off larger pieces from a chunk of stone, and how the point of an antler can then make finer strategic subtractions. She pointed out rawhide used to lash together the frame of a wigwam. She handed me a buckskin bag in the shape of a snowman, sewed shut and filled with sand, which people used to throw and catch in a game called double ball. And here's a few more images from the Jamestown Museum, some skull and antlers being used as kind of a rack to keep things in place. Here's a different interpreter. She's obviously wearing buckskin and she's making cordage out of rawhide. And this is something that I made actually in a workshop, which is also described in the book. This is an awl made from the ulna bone, which is this bone here. That is kind of similar to the awl that this woman in the book was using to punch holes around the edge of the hide. And still, we'd only scratched the surface. When I got home that night, I'd find a package waiting for me, 6 back issues of the Bulletin of Primitive Technology, which I'd ordered hoping they'd hold more secrets of a deer's utility. I found the mother lode in the spring 2000 issue, which contained a hand-lettered list entitled 101 Things to Do with a Deer. It began by listing edible parts and ways to preserve them, including pemmican, defined as pounded jerky with fat. Fur had also talked about making venison stew with corn and dried pumpkin from the museum gardens. But most of the 101 uses on this list were not for food. The left column named parts of the animal: hair, hide, fat, sinew, organs, bones, antlers, hooves, teeth, eyeballs, blood, even scat and urine. And the right column read like a list of human needs, from essentials to enrichments, each need matched with a body part on the left. That list helped me imagine a life in which I could stuff my child's pillow with deer fur, use the fluid from an eyeball for pigment, make a sack from the membrane that surrounds a deer's heart. The longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to diagram a relation, human and world, person and animal. The complementarity of it all, the sense that for every item people wanted, there was a corresponding resource at hand, offered by an animal or a plant, felt so utterly different from our own world, in which Dremel tools are made from fossil fuels and mined metal, Dawn dish soap comes from a lab, and they both are acquired using a debit card in a big box store. The list was the opposite of abstract, the opposite of outsourced. It outlined an existence firmly anchored to a local, self-generating reality. and it represented an entirely different paradigm of waste. If every part of an animal was used, there was little waste to begin with, and any minor scrap that did go unused would simply return to the earth, feeding small creatures and the soil. Whitetails are an abundant resource in the landscape around my home. There is nothing to stop me from harvesting and using that resource, except my own lack of knowledge and skills. From hunting on through skinning, tanning, butchering, carving, sewing, making cordage. Up to that moment, about the only thing I'd managed to do with deer parts was eat venison chili cooked by my brother and set a rack of antlers on my porch next to the potted geraniums. In truth, there was a missing third column on this list. It would appear in the center, and it would name the skills and hint at all the ingenuity and tenacity they require that marry the animal parts to the human needs. It takes culture to turn a deer into a life-sustaining resource. The more I contemplated it, the more it seemed like a major miracle that a deer's body, which exists first for the sake of the deer, was also such a complete package of life-supporting gifts for humans. The miracle materialized in that invisible center column. Back under the catalpa, claytor and fur were absorbed in picking away at the membrane with tools and fingernails. It clung and resisted like strong tape. When it pulled away in bits and swaths, each fiber let go with an audible zip, leaving behind a whitish, velvety surface like that of the finished buckskin I'd handled earlier. Before I left, Claytor wanted to show me something, an old scar on the flesh side of the deer skin. Maybe it went through a barbed wire fence and got snagged, she said. She'd also found a clump of half a dozen ticks embedded in the neck fur. When you get through all those layers, you can see the deer's life. In 1786, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams went on a tour of English gardens and found deer still playing a prominent role in that country's loftier outdoor settings. Jefferson, ever the data geek, recorded 200 to 300 deer at an estate called Hagley and 2,000 at Blenheim. Meanwhile, back in the infant nation the two tourists had helped to found, deer had played a key part in a meeting of cultures already underway for several centuries. There's a famous image that survives from the dawn of that colonial era. There we go. Okay. Here it is. Picture a winding stream, and on one bank, a group of 5 deer. On the other side, 3 more deer, but wait, these have too many legs, and they have arms, and their hands are holding weapons. As the real deer on the right bank have just started to figure out, the deer on the left bank are human hunters in disguise, the skins of bucks draped over their backs. Deer legs dangle over their human hips and shoulders, hooves brushing the ground. The hollowed out heads of the skins fit like helmets over human heads, with heavy racks of antlers. The coup de grace of the disguise is the perfect alignment of the deerskin's hollow eye holes over the keen, predatory eyes of the men. All 3 of them are poised to shoot. In disguise, they've been able to creep forward to point-blank range. 2 deer are already leaping away, alarmed, but the 3 big remaining bucks seem to have a fraction of a second left to live. Hunters, even today, talk about the importance of getting inside the mind of the deer. These hunters inhabit not only the minds, but the bodies of their targets, taking on their appearance, emulating their habits, adopting a 4-legged posture. Their method is a Mobius strip of transfiguration. Become a deer in deer's eyes by looking through the actual eyes of deer. This engraving was published in a 1591 book by Theodore de Bry, a European artist who never left Europe. His images of Timucuan people in Florida reflected the European mind as much as they did any sort of North American reality. Regardless, they became important seeds for early European notions of what Native Americans and North America itself were like. The Timucuans may in fact have used deerskin disguises. Some tribes certainly did. Either way, DeBry's book as a whole clearly suggests that deer were a major feature of the Florida landscape. In its pages, deer appear as reliably as trees, frisking near the river, arranged among trees heavy with fruit, being hunted and butchered. Posing no threat to human safety, they place themselves near human settlement and get busy with the task of accumulating calories, ready for harvest. Along with alligators, deer are the standout animals in the book, but its most searing images concern people. The native people are depicted as cannibals, limb hackers, flesh roasters. It's clear that immersion in this volume for a 16th century European would have produced two major impressions of the New World. One, that it hosted an utterly foreign and bloodthirsty culture. Two, that it was a wilderness, fat with food. Just like DeBry, colonists on both coasts noted the way native people relied on deer, and they exuberantly described the American continent as replete with game. The colonist George Percy noted a, quote, great store of deer in Jamestown in 1607. 5 deer showed up to the party we mythologize as the first Thanksgiving, along with fowl, the only meat source mentioned by name in Edward Winslow's description of the 1621 festivities in Plymouth. In what we now call California, Sir Francis Drake went for the word infinite when estimating the number of deer he observed, adding that the animals were very large and fat. In indigenous America, the work of culture had interwoven human activity with cosmology and myth, a warp and weft of meaning in which an animal could be honored even at the moment of its killing. But settlers saw the New World as just that, a world, a boundless universe provided by God for their exploitation. Compared with the tight controls over deer and other resources they'd long known in Europe, settlers found this place giddily abundant. Meanwhile, in the eyes of the European leather industry, the North American colonies were a vast storehouse of raw material. Manufacturing acted as a gravitational pull that eventually extracted millions of deerskins from the continent. The hide trade started small, but in Virginia, it was ample enough to warrant government regulation as early as 1630. By the turn of the 18th century, British merchants in particular had established the deerskin trade as a key industry in several southern colonies. In a one-year period in the 1740s, for example, Carolina exported something like 150,000 deerskins. The rapid growth of several colonial cities, including Augusta and Charleston, was largely due to their role as hubs in the deerskin trade. After being harvested by native hunters, skins went on to be processed most often by native women. Their labor added significantly to the value of the skins. It was a little like the way people value Navajo rugs today. Tradition and generational expertise, plus perhaps an idea of authenticity, are part of what non-native customers pay for. The indigenous brain tanning method produced a superior and malleable leather. In exchange, traders offered manufactured goods like fabric, metal tools, kettles, beads, and muskets, and eventually rum. The leather makers wanted deerskins because, for one thing, they were versatile. Buckskin, a term which, then as now, was a general moniker that didn't necessarily denote the deer's sex, found its way into everything from footwear to harnesses and saddles. Fashion played a role too, just as it famously did in the overhunting of North American beaver, their pelts used to make gentlemen's hats. In the case of buckskin breeches, though, it was the British working classes that started the trend. From there, the craze moved to the upper classes and to men abroad. Buckskin breeches, it seems, served as the 18th century equivalent of modern denim jeans, writes the historian Catherine Brond. Some of the products made from those hides in Europe eventually found their way back to the colonies. So a deer skin harvested from the southern Appalachians may have crossed the ocean twice before winding up as a pair of breeches or gloves worn by a Virginia planter or a Massachusetts lawyer. 4 days after watching Claytor stretch the hide, I was back at the museum. In the meantime, she'd been working hard on drying and scraping. In fact, she had to take a day off to rest her aching hands. "I went too hard," she said. "I couldn't sleep." A loose pile of fur under the catalpa tree attested to her labors. It was another sunny afternoon, and we were now up the hill in an open area where 2 fork-shaped sticks standing in the ground supported a horizontal pole, over which the hide was now draped. Claytor, in blue latex gloves, was pulling and squeezing the skin, making liquid drip from it into a tin tub below. It held a couple of inches of what looked like dirty milk. This was the brain tanning solution. It was a little anticlimactic. I pictured something much gorier. Claytor assured me that when she first started to work with it that morning, it really did look like a brain, but now it had been mashed into a slurry and mixed with warm water. I'd heard Claytor and Fur repeat the maxim to a number of guests by now, that any animal's brains are adequate to tan its hide. But they didn't actually use deer brains anymore at this museum. Chronic wasting disease, a fatal neurological ailment, had been found in deer nearby. Although the affliction has never been known to jump to humans, the interpreters weren't taking any chances. Instead, they were using pork brains from a local butcher. Sore hands aside, Claytor was feeling very satisfied. "This is the part I just think is so stinking cool," she said. "The structure of it doesn't feel like skin, it feels like fabric. This is looking really good." She and Fur had a go at stretching together, grasping the edges of the skin and leaning their weight backward away from each other. I could actually see the hide expanding as they did. For a minute, their bodies made a symmetrical shape, 2 women on either side of a skin, a truly ancient tableau, and one that could have become a visual icon just as easily as the analogous form of a hunter squinting down an arrow shaft. But the women's work has not carried through into our modern consciousness in that way. I'd been reading about how trading furs and skins to Europeans brought deep change to indigenous societies. It spurred competition among tribes and rewarded those who had acquired guns. It sometimes encouraged families to compete within their villages, too, as a more individualistic mindset came in alongside the traditional communitarian ways. At some sites, the objects people buried with their dead show that in the colonial period, they were beginning to emphasize social differences through possessions more than they had in the past. People let go of certain traditional crafts as metal tools replaced stonework, and fabric gradually took the place of buckskin. Gender roles changed, though not in any straightforward way. Europeans tended to approach native men, not women, when they wanted to bargain. On the other hand, traders also frequently took native wives, giving those individual women influence in their positions as mediators. Sometimes women gained autonomy when their men left home to hunt for long periods of time. Other times, they found themselves pushed to the margins by a new economic system that rewarded men's activities more than their own. Cherokee women, writes the historian Theda Perdue, now needed deerskins and the men who provided them to purchase the very hoes with which they cultivated their corn. This was a subtle shift because men had always provided the deer, but the deer used to furnish directly skins to wear and bones to make hoes. Now their meaning became one step removed, as they provided instead a currency used to purchase clothes and tools. Native people even changed their diets. They now ate more venison compared to pre-trade years when lots of calories had also come from elk and bear. One can imagine that with many deer being killed primarily for their skins, there was plenty of extra venison around. Deer, always significant, became even more so, an answer not only to people's need to survive in the present, but also to their need to deal with the presence of foreigners in a way that they hoped could carry them into a tenable future. It was ultimately too great a charge for the deer population to answer. The numbers simply weren't there. Hunters in the deerskin trade spent more and more time away from their villages, ranging across greater swaths of territory, killing more and more animals. During the peak decades of trade, native hunters across the southeast killed around 1 million deer every year. People had already noted that whitetails were getting scarce near the coasts. By the end of the 18th century, even parts of the American interior were marked more by the absence than the presence of deer. But these losses were only the first wave of what would be a repeated phenomenon in American history. Wherever deer became a commodity, their numbers would dive. The deerskin trade was a locus both for competition between European nations and for the expansion of colonial power along every line from economics to culture to politics. It was like a wedge that helped colonizers drive further and further into the continent. It also caused indigenous groups to go into debt, and that debt was part of what eventually separated them from their land. 2.5 million acres of Cherokee and Creek land, for example, were ceded to Georgia in 1773 to cover debts. In one particularly sinister move as president, Thomas Jefferson caused his administration to extend credit to Creek Indians, quote, beyond their individual means of paying, knowing that land cessions would end up being the native nation's only way to make good, and that loss of hunting grounds would pressure them to take up farming instead. Eventually, the market shifted, overhunting took its toll, and demand for deer skins waned. The American Revolution put a final end to the business. But just as the colonies had now launched themselves on a new trajectory, the long-standing trade in deerskins had helped to set native people on a path that led inexorably toward an utterly unfamiliar future. Claytor folded the hide in quarters and plunged it into the brain solution, which I now saw was chalkier than I'd thought. There would be several more rounds of soaking and wringing today. She had hours of labor in front of her. Clearly, her work demanded patience, endurance, and a very specific type of curiosity that went well beyond the idle interest of a wandering museum goer. It occurred to me that in watching Claytor as she processed this deerskin, I had become another in a long line of white people, going back to the 1500s, who have arrived out of an alien context and observed in its brilliance this native art. So this chapter, which you've now heard most of, goes on to talk about how buckskin became not only this very important trade item across the Atlantic, but also was just a very key material for colonists themselves on the frontier, and really a symbol of that frontier culture that was developing. So this is what's called a hunting jacket. This is a rather fancy one. I don't think they were all quite this nice, but this is kind of a indigenous influenced garment that white male settlers would wear for kind of being out in the woods and pushing through, vegetation and so forth. Here's a Currier and Ives image with these two hunters in the lower right who are wearing those hunting jackets and the buckskin breeches, and they're bringing home a deer and some other game. And there's a lot that's probably accurate about this image, but you can really see the mythologizing that's happening here too. There's Fess Parker as Davy Crockett in his buckskin getup. And jumping backwards in time a little bit, this is Teddy Roosevelt, who later played a really important role in the history of deer populations and conservation. But as a hunter conservationist, he was very consciously kind of aligning himself with that frontier, pioneering image of Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and folks like that. So he's wearing this wonderful buckskin outfit, which apparently was made for him by Brooks Brothers in New York.
Nice.
So pretty knowing, move on his part. And from here, the book goes on to many other adventures, including watching a set of antlers be measured and scored as a trophy, talking with artists who use deer in their work. This is a mural from that used to be in Charlottesville, Virginia, near where I live. The artist who made this is in the book. And going hunting with my brother in Pennsylvania. So that's it for the reading portion, and from here we can open it up to questions, comments, and deer stories. If anyone has one they'd like to tell. Yes?
So, I told you about Crash Nick, my new dog. We actually, about a month ago, we saw our very first, I saw my very first big rat city bug. He actually noticed it in the brush, and I thought it was like I was looking at a tree stump at first. But he made to go flush it out, and the buck took his time, came out. I've usually only seen bucks with like very small forked tines, but this one was like a fork point on each side. And that's like the first time I've ever seen one that had like a very larger rack. Usually only see them in like rural areas, typically. So
this was in town, and I'm guessing probably in an area where there's not really any hunting that's possible in that spot.
Right, yeah, it was actually, I want to say a couple 100 feet from my apartment.
Yeah, how about that? Yeah, there's a scene later in the book where I'm hunting with my brother in a very rural spot, and we're sitting out for quite a long time and hardly seeing any deer at all, and then we both got a text at the same moment from our other brother who lives right in the city of Pittsburgh, and he sent us a picture of a huge deer, just with giant antlers, just relaxing in his yard, totally unafraid. And it's very fascinating, the surprise that we still have seeing big deer in urban places. We just sort of insist on associating them with wilderness places and open land and public land and all of that. And the fact is that they're becoming more and more of an urban species because they're able to thrive so well among humans and in human spaces, and they're actually declining a bit in those kind of wilderness zones or older forests. There's just less for them to eat there. So yeah, thank you for that story.
Well, just a comment based on what you just said. I recently moved to North Carolina from Maine.
Oh.
And in Maine, you just don't put your eyes on deer nearly as often as here, and the hunting is so regulated there. You have to be a lottery and be selected to be able to hunt. It's not. Anyway, it's just regulated.
You can't just buy your license.
And it's a much more rural state. There's a lot of wilderness there.
Yeah.
It's just,
and you have moose there too.
Yes.
The largest members of the deer family.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so they are there.
Did you get to see moose when you lived there? Yeah,
absolutely.
That's very jealous. I'd really like to see
really
moose. Yeah, cool. Any others?
And you mentioned at the beginning your deer stories. Mine's two different things. I didn't live where deer were, like in fresh-built suburbs as a little girl. And Bambi was my introduction, and it tore me up. So I had this built-in compassion and love of deer because, that's a good story, but it's quite tragic.
Yes.
But I didn't see any. But then my family moved back to where they were from, Pennsylvania to Virginia, and that was when I started seeing deer, and I still love them. And then this time around, my uncles actually were hunters, and probably near where you are in Virginia. But my one uncle, my favorite one, used a bow, and somehow me and the bow and my aunt, you know, so it was a real mixture of things for me. But I wouldn't hunt them or eat them anymore. But I understood it because I had exposure to it. And here I live around deer. I'm like not 5 miles from where we're sitting, and deer. When I drive home tonight, they might be hanging out.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize about how rural areas have had such a diminishment. And where my family lives in Northern Virginia, you know, they are culling the deer because, you know, we have a family that have woods and neighborhoods, but they're, you know, come out and shoot them. And I'm like, I don't know. But what are you going to do? So it's like, that's why I was drawn to come to your, because your book is like about this plus more. This is what we live with.
Yeah.
Shooting the deer in the suburbs. I mean, I'm not going to do that where I live.
Well, you've just named, you know, probably 8 or 10 different very interesting issues that are part of this topic. And, you know, everything from the influence of Bambi, which is really considerable, really huge for a lot of people, you know, and I think a lot of people had that formative experience of watching that movie as young children, and it really does. It stays with people. I've heard lots of people say that. You know.
Now, do they bring up Bambi meets Godzilla?
Is that a real thing?
Yes, it is.
It is.
I won't. Let's not tell them what it's about.
Okay.
Well,
I'm gonna have to look
it's
this
a
up.
comedic short.
Okay.
Animated comedic
I
short.
will look it up.
And it's quite funny. So that's a different version.
Yeah.
But you were making the bigger points of all the
just
involved.
You know the feelings that we have about these animals that are so, you know, kind of tangled and so much implicated in the way we think through these kind of practical issues. Like what do we do when we have a suburban or a, you know, town setting where people feel that there are too many deer? Well, where are those feelings coming from? What is that really based on? How would you measure that? These turn out to be, you know, that question alone is like a chapter or more of this book, because it's very hard to measure that. And then
they're eating my flowers is what my family told me.
You know, they do.
Like, oh my gosh.
They do certain things that really annoy people. So feelings run high, and even, you know, when a community starts discussing that question, should we cull or should we allow, you know, recreational hunters to kind of come in under special regulations and hunt in a populated area? You know, you might have kind of wildlife biologists or people from the scientific world showing up to those discussions and kind of offering some numbers and some rational basis for figuring this out, but that does not mean that that is the decision that will be made, because there's just a lot of emotion around it, and those discussions tend to be kind of polarized, like so many other things in our world right now.
I don't want to dominate the conversation,
No,
but
please, go
I
ahead.
think in our interview, I think I might have mentioned Bambi, or I may not have, but Bambi was formative for me too. I think I took the opposite direction from most people when they see Bambi. More so the circle of life and like the beauty of life and death coming over and over again.
Yeah.
I think it was impactful for me, and also where the red fern grows, I mentioned.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that for sure.
I think more so for me, hunting is definitely more like the kind of like, not necessarily Teddy Roosevelt-esque, but more like compassionate, like hunter, in touch with nature, conservationist type thing. That's the way that I experience nature, as well as like you don't have to kill everything you see, which, you know, for me, you know, I haven't still hunted yet. But it's more about being among nature and learning how the deer thinks, trying to think like the deer, trying to embody the life of the deer, not necessarily like, oh, I'm gonna bat this one.
Yeah, not the trophy mindset necessarily.
Right, and I think in part that movie helped develop that kind of like compassion and like the enjoyment of the beauty of nature, as well as like sitting in front of the TV watching nature documentaries as a young child and reading about animals. A lot of my friends who are hunters they're also like fans of animation and Bambi too, but also it's kind of like a double-edged sword in which they kind of blame it, which is partially justified for the reason why people are so rabidly like anti-hunting. And similar media like that as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you raise a lot of interesting points there, but the I don't think it's wrong for hunters to see Bambi as a film, as a kind of formative, influence for people who oppose hunting. And actually, as soon as the movie came out, which was in the early 40s, the hunting community kind of saw that PR problem, and named it and said, this is kind of a PR disaster for us. And they were really right. I mean, it's just amazing how
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, how influential it was. And the Felix Salten, I know you've read that book, the original Bambi novel. Felix Salten, who wrote that, was a hunter. So it's the history of that story is much more complex than I think we would probably assume if we just kind of watch the movie, especially as
children. Look into that.
I mean, and also because Felix himself, he was Jewish, and when the book came out in the 1920s, it was Europe in the 1920s. Lots of his detractors called it Jewish propaganda, and they saw kind of like him comparing. They projected and they compared the plight of the deer being hunted to the situation of anti-Semitism building up in Europe, and they saw it as a commentary, which it wasn't. It was not allegory. It was purely a book about a deer, a life of the deer, and people projected that, and I think that we project a lot of ourselves and a lot of our opinions about animals through animals, and we use that politically and just in modern discourse and past discourse as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the sort of deer as victim is definitely, I have a chapter about that in the book as well. It's just like, that's a really strong trope that is still quite active. If you are like me and you have news alerts about deer, which you may not, but this is go figure. But that is a really repeating story in the news, today, currently, is kind of like deer falls into an icy river and somebody rescues it, or deer gets stuck in a storm drain, or like deer get into accidents a lot, and a lot of it is because of kind of human infrastructure. They fall into or get stuck in things that we've put into the landscape, but there's this kind of little hero story that we like to tell about the nice person who saved the deer. So it's very interesting that they're playing that role for us, and they we're seen to be playing that role kind of in that context of the Holocaust as well, the run up to the Holocaust. LeSean is someone I interviewed in the book, so if you read the book, you'll meet her there as well and find out more about her relationship to hunting. Well, if any last questions or stories?
I have the opposite story. Is I feed a deer. That's also polarizing. Some people don't believe in that, but I feed one deer that I got to know, and she's like special to me because she's come back 5 years in a row. So I've known her for 5 years, and she comes back to the woods where I live and gives birth, and then raises her young, and she comes once a day or maybe twice a day, and I feed her and only her, and then I watch them grow up and how she treats her children and them nursing with her, and then she leaves in October and then she comes back in April. So and I named her April and she reminds me of my mother passed, and then I started seeing her, so she reminds me. I have that feeling. So,
yeah. Have you ever been so lucky as to see her give birth or get ready to give birth?
No, I've only seen that she's pregnant, and then I don't see her for a while, and then she comes back, and then all of a sudden there's her her two.
She usually has two.
That's
Usually
wonderful.
two. 1 year she had one, but that's
Mhm.
so I can count how many years that she comes back. So it's like she's a friend that I'm looking forward to seeing. So
Yeah, a neighbor.
yeah, and it's
That's
fascinating
wonderful.
to observe her.
Yeah.
So that's why I was attracted to your book.
Cool. Well, thanks for telling us about her.
Hey,
Oh, I hope you see her this year.
But
Yeah.
I said I hope you see her this year.
I actually saw her 3 days ago. I looked out my window and there was a group of females hanging around together, and I looked out and they were, foraging, and one deer was looking up at the window at me. And I was like, oh, that's April. And so I went down to feed her, and then she ran off with everybody else. But everyone ran off, but she stayed.
Oh.
Ate some food and then ran off with them. So I was honored that.
Yeah.
So.
That's cool. Well, thank you all so much for being here, coming out on a slightly bleak afternoon, and for sharing your stories and listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very
thank
much.
you so much.
Are you on a tour?